Gideon Crow sat behind his mahogany desk 12 years ago, reading a letter that wasn't his to read. Then he lit a match and watched it burn. He didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He simply folded his hands, called for his secretary, and dictated two new letters, one for Ronan, one for Eliza, each one a masterpiece of cruelty disguised as goodbye. He destroyed 2 lives before breakfast. And then he went to church. That is the kind of man we are dealing with. If someone did that to you, stole the person you loved, stole the years, stole the child you never knew existed, what would you do when the truth finally surfaced? If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and follow this journey all the way to the end, because what comes next will leave you breathless. Smash that like button and drop your city and country in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the morning everything changed. The sun had barely cracked the ridge when Ronan Hale heard the wheels. He was already up. He was always already up. Sleep had never been something Ronan trusted entirely. Too many years of watching for drought, for thieves, for the kind of trouble that only announces itself after it's already too late. He'd been standing at the fence line with a tin mug of coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, staring at nothing in particular, the way a man does when he's exhausted but his mind won't quit. The sound reached him before he saw anything. A carriage. Moving slow. Too slow for a delivery, too deliberate for a lost traveler. He didn't move right away. He just watched. The vehicle came around the bend in the road that cut through the lower pasture. One horse, dust-covered, the kind of carriage that had been driven hard over bad roads and hadn't been cleaned since. Ronan set his mug on the fence post. He crossed his arms. Some instinct he couldn't name made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, and he told himself it was probably the cold. It wasn't the cold. The carriage stopped about 40 yards from where he stood. The driver, a young man he didn't recognize, climbed down from the seat and opened the door with the careful attention of someone who'd been paid to treat his passengers gently. A woman stepped out first. Ronan's brain registered several things in sequence, the way a man's mind does when it's trying to protect him from something it already understands. He noticed the dark green traveling dress. He noticed the way she moved, measured, like someone who had rehearsed this moment too many times and was now terrified she'd forgotten her lines. He noticed the dark hair, the set of her shoulders. Then she looked up, and 12 years collapsed like a wall. Eliza. He didn't say it out loud. The word came up into his throat and just stopped there. He couldn't have spoken if someone had put a gun to his head. He stood absolutely still while his heart did something violent and painful inside his chest, and he thought, distantly, stupidly, that his coffee was still sitting on the fence post getting cold. She hadn't moved either. She was looking at him the same way he was looking at her, like neither of them was entirely sure the other was real. Then the driver offered his hand again, and a second figure stepped down from the carriage. A child. A girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, in a brown traveling coat that was slightly too big for her. She took the driver's hand, stepped down carefully, and then stood beside Eliza and looked across the pasture at Ronan with an expression that was frank and unafraid, and, God help him, familiar in a way that made no sense. Even from 40 yards, even in the flat morning light, Ronan could see it. The girl had his eyes. Not similar. Not a passing resemblance. His eyes. The exact gray-green that his mother used to call storm water, and that Ronan had spent his whole life being mildly self-conscious about because it wasn't a common color, and people always noticed. His knees didn't buckle. He was a man who had pulled calves in blizzards and talked his way out of claims disputes with men who carried knives. His knees didn't buckle, but it was close. He made himself walk toward them, one foot, then the other. The pasture grass was wet with dew, and it soaked through the leather of his boots, and he noticed that in some peripheral corner of his brain, while the rest of him was entirely occupied with the question that was detonating over and over behind his eyes. Who is that child? He stopped about 10 feet from them. Up close, Eliza looked, different and exactly the same, the way people do after years. There were lines at the corners of her eyes now that hadn't been there before. Something careful in her expression, something guarded, that he didn't remember. She had been different once, easier, lighter. He wondered, with a cold and sickening clarity, what had taken that out of her. Ronan, her voice. Still the same voice, lower maybe, more controlled. Eliza. His came out rough, like something that had been stored in a dry place too long. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The girl was watching this exchange with the intense, slightly uncomfortable attention of a child who has been told something important is about to happen and has been waiting for it for a long time. Eliza put her hand on the girl's shoulder. "This is Maisie," she said. And then she took a breath, a visible breath, the kind a person takes before stepping off a ledge, and said, "She's yours, Ronan. She's your daughter." He heard the words. He understood them individually, but his brain put up a wall against them and refused to let them in all at once. That's... He stopped, started again. "Eliza, what are you... I know." She was steadier than he expected. He would understand later that she had been preparing for this conversation for 11 years, running it in her head so many times that she had finally worn through the panic to something that was almost calm on the surface. Almost. Her hands were shaking. She had them clasped in front of her, but they were shaking. "I know how this sounds. I know what you must be thinking. Please just let me explain." Maisie had not looked away from Ronan. She was studying him with those gray-green eyes, his eyes, and the expression on her face was not anxious exactly. It was searching, like she was trying to match him to something she'd been imagining for a long time. Ronan looked at the girl for a long moment. He was not a man who cried. That's not a point of pride, just a fact. He'd learned early that the frontier had no patience for public grief, and he'd made himself accordingly. But something was happening behind his face that he was working very hard to control, and he was grateful for the years of practice. He crouched down to her level. It felt like the right thing. He didn't know if it was. "Maisie," he said. "Yes, sir," she said. Quiet voice, direct. "How old are you?" 11, she said. "Almost 12? In March." He did the arithmetic without wanting to. He couldn't help it. March, 11 years ago. 11 years ago would have been 9 months after. He stood back up. He turned away for a moment, just a moment, because he needed his face to do something private. When he turned back, Eliza was watching him with an expression that contained everything she hadn't said yet and probably couldn't say in front of the child. "Come inside," he said. His voice came out flat and controlled in a way that probably sounded angry. He wasn't angry. He was something much more complicated than angry, and he didn't have a word for it. "Both of you, I'll get Maisie something to eat, and you can..." He stopped. "We need to talk." Maisie ate scrambled eggs and 3 pieces of toast with an appetite that was both completely normal and somehow devastating to watch. She sat at Ronan's kitchen table in a house she'd never been in and ate like she belonged there. And Ronan stood at the stove with his back to both of them because he didn't trust his expression yet. He'd sent the carriage driver to the bunkhouse. The man could eat with the hands. This wasn't his conversation. "She doesn't know everything," Eliza said quietly from behind him. She was at the table too, but she'd barely touched the coffee he'd poured her. "I've told her about you, that you're her father, that there were circumstances. She knows you didn't know about her." "What does she think happened?" Ronan asked, still not turning around. "I told her there was a misunderstanding," Eliza said. "When she's older, I'll tell her the rest." "The rest?" Ronan repeated. He turned around now. He couldn't keep his back to her and have this conversation. "What exactly is the rest, Eliza? Because I have 12 years of questions and I need you to start talking." She glanced at Maisie, who was methodically working through her 3rd piece of toast and doing an 11-year-old's version of pretending not to listen, which wasn't terribly convincing. "After breakfast," Eliza said. He nodded. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from his daughter. The word hit him again, small and enormous at the same time, and asked Maisie if she'd ever been on a cattle ranch before. "No, sir," she said. "You want to see it after you eat?" She considered this seriously, the way children do when they don't want to appear too eager. "Yes, sir," she said, "if that's all right." It's your father's ranch, Eliza said softly. You don't have to say, if that's all right. Maisie looked at Eliza, then looked at Ronan, apparently deciding something. Okay, she said, and went back to her toast. Go. Ronan took Maisie to the stables first because that was where 11-year-olds needed to be on a ranch. He showed her the horses, all 7 of them, and watched her face open up in a way that made something in his chest hurt. She wasn't afraid of them. She walked right up to the bay mare, Fern, who was particular about strangers, and held out her hand without being told to, and Fern dropped her nose into the girl's palm like she'd known her for years. She likes you, Ronan said. I like her, Maisie said. She was stroking Fern's nose with a seriousness and tenderness that looked familiar. He'd seen it somewhere. It took him a moment to realize he'd seen it in a mirror. He left her with his ranch hand, a patient 18-year-old named Cody who had a younger sister and knew how to talk to kids. He told Cody to show Maisie around the stables, just the stables, and walked back to the house. Eliza was standing by the window when he came in. She'd washed the coffee cups. He noticed that. A nervous habit, washing things. He'd known that about her once. He was startled to find he still did. Tell me, he said. He didn't sit down. Neither did she. She told him. She started from the beginning, from the letter she'd received, the one with Ronan's handwriting on the envelope that had said, in plain and devastating language, that he had reconsidered, that he was sorry, that he thought it was better this way. She'd read that letter so many times she could still recite it. She'd read it until the paper wore through at the folds. She'd believed every word. It wasn't in your handwriting, Ronan said. I know that now, she said. I didn't know it then. I'd only ever seen your handwriting a few times. I didn't know the difference. Her jaw tightened. I was 22, Ronan. I was frightened and I was alone, and the man I was going to build a life with had just written to say he didn't want me anymore. I believed it because... She stopped. Because part of me always thought you were too good to be real, that something would go wrong. I was ready to believe it. He wanted to say something about that, about the fact that she'd ever thought she needed to brace herself against him. He kept it back. This wasn't the moment. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after I got that letter, she said. I was staying with my aunt in Carver County. I wrote to you. I wrote 3 times. Ronan felt something cold move through him. I never received 3 letters from you. I know that now, she said again. The phrase was becoming a kind of terrible refrain. I thought... She looked at the floor for a moment. I thought you'd decided you didn't want me. I assumed you wanted even less to do with the situation when I wrote to tell you about the baby. I thought you were just ignoring me, and I was... Her voice cracked, just slightly, and she pressed her lips together and controlled it. I was too proud to beg. I told myself I didn't need you. I told myself Maisie and I would be fine. Were you? He asked. He didn't know why he asked. Maybe because he needed to know whether his ignorance had cost them the way he thought it had. She met his eyes. We survived, she said. It wasn't fine, but we survived. He put his hands on the back of a kitchen chair and gripped it. Not because he needed to hold on to something, but because he needed to do something with his hands. Who wrote the letters? He said. It wasn't a question. He had a feeling that had started to form the moment he'd seen the carriage, a feeling that was coalescing into something specific and ugly. Who forged them? Eliza was quiet for a moment. Gideon Crow, she said. The name landed like a fist. Ronan let go of the chair. He straightened up slowly. He looked at the wall above Eliza's head for a moment, not seeing it, just needing somewhere to look that wasn't at her while he processed what had just been put in front of him. Gideon Crow, the county land commissioner. A man Ronan had shaken hands with at a dozen public meetings. A man who had ruled every water rights decision and deed filing in this county for the better part of a decade. A man who smiled with his teeth and never with his eyes. A man who had, once, 12 years ago, expressed an interest in Eliza that she had politely declined. He wanted you, Ronan said. Flat, quiet. Yes. And when you told him you were with me, I didn't tell him directly, but he knew. Gideon always knew things. She crossed her arms over herself, not defensively, protectively, like she was cold. I think he'd been watching for an opportunity. Our letters would have passed through the Carver County Postal Office. He had connections there. He always had connections everywhere. She paused. He intercepted what you sent me, and what I sent you, and replaced them. But Ronan was quiet for so long that the only sound in the kitchen was the wind coming off the ridge. "Do you have proof?" he asked finally. "Yes," she said, and that single word, spoken without drama, without theatrics, just quietly and certainly, that word changed everything. She reached into the bag she'd set beside the door and withdrew a folded envelope. The paper was old, fragile at the creases. She unfolded it carefully and set it on the table between them. "This is what you actually wrote to me," she said. "The real letter. I found it in Gideon's desk 2 years ago when I was in Millhaven on other business. He'd kept it. I think he kept it as a trophy." Her voice held something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, and was probably some combination of the two that didn't have a name. He kept the evidence of what he'd done in his own desk. That's the kind of man he is. He never thought anyone would ever find it. Ronan picked up the letter. He recognized the handwriting immediately, obviously. It was his own. But that wasn't the thing that hit him first. The thing that hit him first was the date. 12 years ago, 3 weeks before the frontier's worst winter. He had been about to ask Eliza to marry him. He could see it in the letter. He didn't have to read far. The tone was wrong for a goodbye letter because it wasn't a goodbye letter. It was the letter of a man who was thinking about a future, a man who was happy. He set it back down. "He let us both think we'd been abandoned," Ronan said. His voice had gone very quiet. That was a thing that happened to him when he was genuinely furious. He got quieter, not louder. He kept this whole time. Yes. And he's still in office. Yes. Something shifted in his chest. Settled. Got very still. "He doesn't know you found it," Ronan said. Eliza shook her head. "I left Millhaven quietly. I've been moving carefully since. But Ronan," she looked at him directly. "He has eyes everywhere. He'll find out I came here. And when he does, he's going to move against us. Against you specifically. Your water rights come up for review next month. He's the one who controls that review." Ronan looked at her, at the letter on the table, at the door to the stable yard where, somewhere out there, a girl with his eyes was meeting horses for the first time. "Then we don't give him time," he said. Eliza studied his face. "What does that mean?" "It means I have 11 years to make right," he said. "And I am not going to spend one more day letting Gideon Crow decide how that goes." That evening, after Maisie had been installed in the spare room with a quilt that had been in Ronan's family for 40 years and was asleep within minutes of her head touching the pillow. Children could do that, fall off the edge of sleep like it was nothing, and Ronan found he envied it. He and Eliza sat on the porch in the cold, not talking for a while. Sometimes not talking is what two people need most. "She's remarkable," he said finally. "She is," Eliza said, quiet and certain, the way a person says something they've known for a long time. "She's angry sometimes," Eliza added after a pause. "She won't say it, but she is. About not having a father, about not knowing. I think she's decided to reserve judgment on you." "That's fair," Ronan said. "She's fair," Eliza agreed. "She gets that from, She stopped. "From who?" he asked. Eliza glanced at him sideways. "Honestly? Both of us. Which is either very good or very bad." He almost laughed. It came out as something shorter than a laugh, but real, at least. The first real thing since morning. The wind came off the ridge, and they sat in it, and somewhere inside the house Maisie slept, and the letter sat on the kitchen table under a coffee mug Ronan had set on top of it to keep it flat. Tomorrow, Gideon Crow would wake up not knowing that everything had changed. Ronan intended to make that period of ignorance as short as possible. 3 days later, the news reached Gideon. Ronan knew the exact moment it happened because he was in town at the feed store when he saw Gideon's personal secretary walk past the window in the direction of the commissioner's office at something close to a run. Men like Gideon always had someone watching the roads. Ronan had expected it. He'd spent 3 days quietly preparing, not loudly, not conspicuously, but preparing. He'd visited 2 men he trusted absolutely. He'd made certain copies of the letter existed in more than one place. He'd written down everything Eliza had told him in precise, dated language and filed it with someone Gideon did not control. He'd also, in those 3 days, taught Maisie how to check the fence line. She'd asked, on the second morning, whether she could come with him on his rounds. He'd said yes before he'd finished processing the question. They'd walked 2 miles of fence line together in near silence, and she'd asked practical questions, not about the situation, not about him, not about any of the things that must have been circling in her head, about the cattle, about the land, about why certain fence posts were set differently than others. She was a child who was deciding whether to trust someone and was doing it by watching how he worked. He understood that. He respected it. He didn't push. On the third evening, she'd said, without looking at him, while they were walking back to the barn, "My mother says you didn't know." "I didn't know," he said. She considered this, kept walking. "Okay," she said. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't even full acceptance, but it was the door opening a crack, and he took it for what it was. The morning after Gideon's secretary ran past the feed store window, a man appeared at Ronan's gate. A legal man by the look of him, the kind of coat, the kind of papers in his hand. He informed Ronan that the water rights review had been moved up. New information had come to light. The commissioner's office would require Ronan's presence at a formal hearing in 5 days. Ronan accepted the papers without expression. He went inside and told Eliza. She'd gone pale, but she hadn't flinched. 5 days, she said. 5 days, he confirmed. She sat down. She put her hands flat on the table. She looked at the letter, still there, still under the coffee mug, and then she looked up at Ronan. "He's trying to rush us," she said. "He wants us off balance." "I know," Ronan said. "He has no idea we've been expecting this." Eliza was quiet for a moment. Then, "What happens to Maisie if this goes wrong?" It was the right question. It was also the most painful one, because it was the one that made everything real in a way that anger and strategy and legal maneuvering couldn't quite do. "Nothing goes wrong," Ronan said. He said it without bluster, without false certainty, just the way he said everything when he meant it, flat and final. "Not this time." Eliza looked at him for a long moment, and she nodded. Outside, they could hear Maisie's voice from the direction of the stable. Talking to Fern, probably, because she went there every morning now, and the sound of it sat between them like a promise neither of them needed to put into words. The hearing notice sat on Ronan's kitchen table for the rest of that day, like something with weight beyond paper. He'd read it 3 times, and each time the language got colder. Irregularities in water usage documentation. Concerns regarding rightful claim to the Eastern Creek access. But language that meant nothing specific and everything at once. The kind of language a man uses when he wants to sound official while doing something entirely unofficial. Ronan had been in this county long enough to know how Gideon Crow operated. He didn't come at you directly. He came at the thing you needed most. Water, in cattle country, was the thing a man needed most. You could rebuild a barn. You could replace fence line. You could not replace water, and everyone knew it, and Gideon had spent 12 years making himself the man who decided where water went and where it didn't. That evening, Ronan sat with Eliza at the kitchen table after Maisie had gone to bed, and they talked through it the way 2 people do when they're trying to build something solid out of what is mostly fear. Eliza had the letter in front of her again. She'd been handling it carefully, almost reverently, the way you handle something fragile that is also the most important thing you own. "He's going to say the letter is forged," Ronan said. "I know." "He's going to say you forged it, that you came back here with a fabricated story and a child who may or may not be—" He stopped, looked at the table. "He'll question Maisie's parentage." Eliza's jaw tightened. "Yes, he will. And he has people who will agree with whatever he says in that room because they owe him or they're afraid of him." Ronan rubbed his hand over his face. The stubble rasped against his palm, and he let the sensation anchor him. "One letter isn't enough, Eliza, even a real one. We need witnesses. We need people who knew about us before he did what he did, people who can speak to the timeline. I've been thinking about that, she said. She turned the letter over in her hands, not looking at it, just holding it. There's a woman in Carver County. Her name is Ruth Alderman. She was a postal clerk 12 years ago. I remembered her because she used to hand sort the morning deliveries herself, kept everything in a particular order. She was proud of it. Eliza paused. I remembered thinking when Gideon's interference would have had to happen that he must have gotten to someone at that office. Ruth was meticulous. If she'd been on duty the day those letters passed through, nothing would have gone wrong. So either he intercepted them before they reached her, or he paid someone else in that office. Or he found a day she wasn't there, Ronan said. Or that, Eliza agreed. Either way, she might remember something. People like Ruth remember everything. That's why they're good at what they do. Ronan thought about this. You haven't contacted her? I was afraid to, Eliza said, simply. No apology in it. I was afraid any contact I made would get back to him before I was ready. I've been ready to come here for 2 years. I just needed to be certain Maisie was old enough to understand some of it. She met his eyes. And if I'm being honest, I needed to be certain I was strong enough to do it without falling apart the moment I saw you. He didn't know what to do with that exactly. He filed it somewhere. I'll ride to Carver County myself, he said. You can't, Eliza said. If you leave now and Gideon finds out, and he will find out, he'll use it. He'll claim you fled, he'll advance the hearing, or he'll do something to the property while you're gone. She shook her head. You have to stay visible. You have to be here, on this ranch, working like nothing has rattled you. That's the only move that doesn't give him ammunition. Ronan looked at her. You've thought about this a lot. I've thought about nothing else for 2 years, she said. And there was something in the way she said it. Not dramatic, not performing, just the flat, exhausted truth of a woman who had spent 2 years carrying a plan and a secret and a child and had not been able to put any of it down. He believed her. He'd have believed her anyway, but he especially believed her right then. I have a man, he said. Abel Pruitt. He's been with me 6 years. He's not loud and he's not showy, and he's exactly the kind of person Gideon would never look at twice. I can send him to Carver County. Does he know how to handle sensitive conversations? He knows how to listen without making people feel like they're being questioned, Ronan said, which is rare and more useful. Eliza considered this and then nodded. All right. That was the first night she stayed in the house, and it was awkward in the way those things are when two people who once knew each other completely have become, in the years between, almost strangers. He gave her the room next to Maisie's. He could hear, through the wall, the murmur of Eliza's voice talking to Maisie for a while before the house went quiet. He lay in his own bed staring at the ceiling and thought about a letter he'd written 12 years ago and never known was stolen, and tried to remember exactly what he'd said in it, and couldn't quite reconstruct the whole thing, and that bothered him more than he expected. He sent Abel to Carver County the next morning before dawn. The 3 days that followed had a strange quality. Not quiet exactly. There was too much going on in Ronan's head for anything to feel quiet, but surface calm in the way a river is sometimes surface calm right before it gets fast and rough. He went about his work. He fixed fence line. He checked on the cattle. He talked to Cody about the condition of the hay supply going into winter. He did all the things a man does when he is trying to make his normal life look like his normal life. And Maisie followed him. Not always. Not in a way that felt demanding, but enough that he began to recognize her patterns. She appeared after breakfast, usually without comment, and fell into step beside him, and if he explained what he was doing, she listened carefully, and if he didn't, she didn't ask right away. She watched first, then asked. He recognized that pattern because it was his own pattern, and recognizing it in her did something to him that he was still trying to work out. On the second morning, she asked him about the cattle in a way that revealed she'd been reading about them. She'd found a book somewhere in the house. He didn't know he still had it, an old cattleman's almanac his father had given him, and she'd been going through it. She asked technical questions, specific questions, questions that revealed she'd understood what she'd read. He answered them straight. He didn't soften them or simplify them. She was sharp enough to know when she was being talked down to, and he got the sense she didn't tolerate it well. You're like your mother, he he said once, without thinking, and she looked at him sideways. How do you know? She said. You haven't seen her in 12 years. He took that one on the chin. Fair point, he said. She thought about it for another moment. She says the same thing, she said, that I'm like her, but she also says I'm stubborn in a way she's not. She glanced at him again. She didn't say where that came from, but I always figured. He didn't say anything to that, but something eased in his chest just slightly. On the evening of the second day, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. Ronan had gone into town for supplies. Necessary, unavoidable, and he'd made sure to take Cody with him so he wasn't alone. He was at the hardware counter when the door opened and Gideon Crow walked in. The man had always known how to make an entrance. Not loudly, quietly. The way powerful people sometimes enter rooms, not announcing themselves but letting the room adjust around their presence. Gideon was maybe 60 now, silver-haired, the kind of lean that comes from discipline rather than hardship. He wore a coat that cost more than some men made in a month. He had 2 men with him, just behind him, just far enough back to be assistants rather than obviously guards. His eyes found Ronan immediately. Ronan didn't move. He stood at the hardware counter with a list in his hand, and he looked back at Gideon Crow for the first time since all of this had become what it now was. And he felt something he hadn't expected, which was almost nothing. Not calm exactly. More like cold. The kind of cold that is actually a very controlled version of something much hotter. Gideon crossed the store. He stopped about 4 feet away and he smiled, which was the thing about him. The smile was genuinely pleasant looking. If you didn't know what was behind it, you could mistake it for warmth. Ronan, he said, I heard you had some visitors. I did, Ronan said. Good news, I hope. Very good news, Ronan said. My daughter's come to stay. Something happened in Gideon's eyes. Very small, very fast, like a door shutting. Is that right? He said. It is. Gideon tilted his head slightly. I wasn't aware you had a daughter. Most people weren't, Ronan said. I wasn't aware of it myself until recently. Turns out some information got delayed, getting to me. He held Gideon's gaze. You know how it is with correspondence. Things go missing sometimes. The air between them tightened. Gideon's 2 men had stopped moving behind him. The hardware clerk had gone very still in the way people go still when they want to hear something but don't want to be noticed hearing it. Ronan, Gideon's voice dropped, just slightly, became a shade more personal, less public. I think it would be worth having a conversation, man to man, before this hearing business gets complicated. What business would that be? Ronan said. The water rights review. A pause. These things can go a number of ways. I've always had a lot of respect for what you've built here. I'd hate to see a misunderstanding cause you problems. I appreciate the concern, Ronan said, but I think the hearing will straighten things out just fine. Another thing in Gideon's eyes. Recalculation. He'd expected something else. Nervousness, maybe, or the kind of careful deference men showed him when they were afraid. He hadn't gotten it, and he was adjusting to that. The woman, Gideon said, more quietly now, almost conversational. Eliza Mercer. I remember her. She had a hard few years, from what I understand. People in difficult circumstances sometimes. Construct narratives. It's not malicious. It's just how people cope with things that didn't go the way they hoped. Ronan looked at him for a long moment. Is that what you think she's doing? He said. Not a question. A statement he was letting Gideon hear while it was still polite. I think you're a good man, Gideon said, and I think you're generous. And I think generous men sometimes get taken advantage of. He smiled again. Just be careful, is all I'm saying. I'll keep that in mind, Ronan said. Gideon nodded. He looked at the list in Ronan's hand like he was reading it, though he wasn't close enough to. Good day, he said, and turned and left, and his 2 men followed him out, and the door closed behind all 3 of them. Cody appeared at Ronan's elbow. What was that? He said. That, Ronan said, was a man who's just figured out he has a problem and is trying to decide how big it is. He paid for his supplies and went home. When he told Eliza that evening, she was quiet for a while. Not the processing kind of quiet. The already knew this was coming kind. He was warning you, she said. He was warning me and also feeling out how much I know, Ronan said. He doesn't know about the letter, not for certain. He knows you came here with a story and a child, but he doesn't know you have the original. He'll start trying to find out, Eliza said. Then we need Abel back before he does. Abel came back on the morning of the 4th day. He came in through the back, which Ronan had asked him to do, and sat down at the kitchen table with his hat in his hands and a look on his face that said he'd found something. His name was Abel Pruitt, 41 years old, with a face like weather-carved rock and a voice so quiet you always leaned in slightly to hear him. He'd been a drifter when Ronan first hired him, and he'd stayed because Ronan had never given him a reason to leave, which Abel apparently found remarkable enough to be loyal over. Ruth Alderman, Abel said, still lives in Carver County. She's not a postal clerk anymore, retired 6 years ago, keeps chickens, talks a lot. He paused. Once I convinced her what I was there for. What did she say? Eliza asked. She was leaning forward across the table. She said she remembered your correspondence, Abel said, looking at Eliza. Both ways. Yours going out to Ronan's address and letters coming in addressed to you. She said there was a period, she gave me the month, and it matches, when she was out with a fever for about 10 days. She said when she came back some things felt wrong about the sorting records, but she couldn't put her finger on it. She'd chalked it up to whoever had covered for her not doing it her way. He set his hat on the table. She said she always wondered about it. Said your name stuck with her because you came in personally once, around that time, to ask if anything had come for you. She remembered you looked scared. Eliza looked at the table. I was, she said quietly. I'd sent 3 letters to Ronan in 2 weeks, and nothing had come back. I was scared, and I didn't know what to think. She's willing to testify? Ronan asked. She said, Abel paused, choosing words. She said she's been carrying a guilty feeling for 12 years about those 10 days. She doesn't know exactly what happened on her watch, but she knows something did. She said if someone's willing to stand up and say it out loud, she'll stand with them. He looked at Ronan. She's not the kind of woman who backs down once she's committed. She'll have to stand in front of Gideon Crow, Ronan said. I told her that, Abel said. She asked me if he still had that smug smile. I said I didn't know. She said she'd always found that smile offensive. Something that was not quite a smile moved across Eliza's face. The first one Ronan had seen from her in 4 days. She'll do, Eliza said. But the relief in the room lasted approximately 2 more hours. Because that afternoon, a man Ronan didn't know arrived at the gate on a horse that had been ridden hard and delivered a message that did not come in an envelope. It was handed over folded, unsealed, clearly meant to be impossible to prove as having originated anywhere official. The message said, "The woman you're harboring has outstanding debts in 2 counties. Her creditors have been made aware of her current whereabouts. Additionally, be advised that the parentage of the child she is presenting as yours has not been established by any legal record. In the interest of protecting you from further embarrassment, the Commissioner's office strongly recommends you consider what you are being asked to involve yourself in." Ronan read it twice, handed it to Eliza. She read it. Her face did not change. She folded it back along its original crease with the steady, deliberate movements of someone who is very precisely not allowing herself to react. "The debts are real," she said. 2 small ones. "I fell behind twice when Maisie was sick. I had to choose between rent and medicine, and I chose medicine. I paid them back eventually, but there will be records of the delinquency." She set the note on the table. "He's been digging." "He's been digging fast," Ronan said. "He has people," Eliza said. "He's always had people." "So do I," Ronan said. Then, because it was honest, fewer but better. Eliza looked at him. "What do we do about the parentage piece? He'll say it publicly. He'll stand in that hearing room and he'll suggest in front of the whole county that Maisie isn't yours, and there's no document that says she is." Ronan thought about it. He thought about the gray-green eyes and the way Maisie had held her hand out to Fern the first morning without being told. He thought about the technical questions from the almanac and the sideways looks and the 11-year-old steadiness that was already, even at that age, recognizable as a quality he knew from inside his own chest. "I'll acknowledge her publicly," he said. "Before the hearing. On the record. At the land office. I'll file a declaration of paternity. Anyone can look at it. He paused. Anyone can look at her for that matter. Eliza stared at him. Gideon will use that as evidence you're being manipulated. Gideon can use whatever he wants, Ronan said. But once it's on public record, it changes what he can do to her. She's not unprotected anymore. Something in his voice flattened out. She was unprotected for 11 years because I didn't know she existed. That stops now. For a moment, Eliza just looked at him. There was something happening in her expression that was complicated. Relief and grief at the same time, which is a specific kind of expression that only appears on someone's face when something good happens too late. You'll need to tell her, Eliza said, what you're doing and why. She's old enough. I know, he said. He found Maisie in the stable, where he'd come to understand she went when things felt crowded inside the house. She was sitting on a hay bale, not doing anything in particular, looking at Fern across the stall door with that focused, quiet attention she applied to most things. He sat down on the hay bale next to her, not too close, gave her room. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him sideways, waiting. I'm going to file papers tomorrow, he said. Legal papers. That say you're my daughter, on the official record. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me, she said. Because it's about you, he said. And you're old enough to know what's being done about you. She considered this. Is it because of the man, the one who made the letters? He looked at her sharply. She met his look evenly. Mom didn't think I was listening, Maisie said, without apology. I was listening. Ronan took a breath. Partly, he said, but mostly because it should have happened 11 years ago, and I can't fix that. I can fix this. Maisie looked at Fern again. The mare had turned to face her stall door with mild interest. My friend Clara back home, Maisie said. Her father didn't want anything to do with her, not because anyone tricked him, just because. She paused. She doesn't talk about it, but I know it hurt her. It would hurt anyone, Ronan said. Yeah. Maisie pulled at a piece of hay. I don't know if I trust you yet, she said. I want to be honest about that. That's fair, he said. But I think you mean what you say, she said, which isn't the same as trusting someone, but it's a start. I'll take it, he said. They sat there for a while longer, not talking, just sitting in the smell of hay and horses while the afternoon light came through the stable slats in long, slow bars. And Ronan thought about 12 years and what they cost, and what might still be built from whatever was left of the time on the other side of them. The next morning, he went to the land office before it officially opened. He knew the clerk, a quiet young man named Harold, who had a good memory and no love for Gideon Crow. Gideon had passed over Harold's father for a surveying contract years ago, and the family had not forgotten. Harold opened the office early, without being asked many questions, and the declaration of paternity was filed and stamped and on record before 9 o'clock. Gideon found out by noon. Ronan knew this because by 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 2 men he didn't recognize rode slowly past the ranch entrance twice, not stopping, just looking. The second time Cody came and found Ronan and told him, and Ronan went to the gate and watched them ride past, and they watched him watch them, and nobody said anything. Intimidation, Cody said. Inventory, Ronan said. He's figuring out what we have. That evening, one of the neighboring ranchers, a man named Bert Carlo, who ran 300 head on the land east of Ronan's, came to the house unannounced. Bert was in his 60s, thick-set, with a white mustache and hands that had been breaking things and fixing them for 40 years. He and Ronan weren't close exactly. They'd shared fence line for a decade and helped each other out when weather made it necessary, which in cattle country was enough to constitute a kind of friendship. Bert came in, accepted coffee, looked at Eliza with the careful, neutral expression of a man who has been told something and is deciding what he thinks of it, and then looked at Ronan. Word's getting around, Bert said. I figured, Ronan said. Version getting around from the commissioner's friends is that you've got a woman here running a con, Bert said. Blunt, which Ronan appreciated. Presenting some other man's child as yours to get her hands on the ranch. And what version are you running? Ronan asked. Bert looked at Eliza again, then at the door toward the hallway, where Maisie had gone to bed an hour ago. Then back at Ronan. I'm here to find out, he said. Eliza put the letter on the table. Bert read it, slowly. He turned it over. He set it down and picked up the forgery copy Eliza had brought, the letter Gideon had sent in Ronan's name, and read that. He put them side by side. He was quiet for a long time. I always thought there was something off about Crow, he said finally. Never could point to what. Just something. He pushed the letters back across the table. I've got 2 other ranchers who feel the same way. Men who've had decisions go against them that didn't make sense. Lost bids, water adjustments that didn't add up. He looked at Ronan. If you're going to fight this in a public hearing, you might want friends in that room. I'd welcome them, Ronan said. Bert nodded, finished his coffee, stood up. He put his hat on and then paused at the door and turned back to look at Eliza. I'm sorry, he said, for what you went through, raising a child alone when you shouldn't have had to. Eliza held his gaze. Thank you, she said. After he left, the kitchen was quiet. Eliza sat with her hands wrapped around her empty coffee cup, and Ronan stood at the window watching Bert's lantern swing away down the road until it disappeared. He'll bring people to that hearing, Ronan said. One man standing up changes the room, Eliza said. Makes it safer for others. That's always how it works, Ronan said. The hearing was 2 days away. The letter was still on the table. Ruth Alderman was in Carver County with a clear conscience and a good memory and a long-standing grudge against improperly sorted mail. Bert Carlo was going home to make 2 telephone calls. The declaration of paternity was on record at the land office. And Gideon Crow, somewhere across town in his house with the good coat hanging by the door, was doing his own calculations with whatever information he had and arriving at conclusions that Ronan suspected were beginning to make him nervous. Not nervous enough to back down. That was not a thing Gideon Crow did, but nervous enough to start making mistakes. And mistakes, in Ronan's experience, were the thing you waited for when everything else was stacked against you. Gideon's mistake came on the morning before the hearing, and it came in the form of a woman named Clara Voss. Ronan didn't know Clara Voss. He'd never heard the name. She arrived at the ranch just after 7 in the morning, driving herself in a small buckboard, which told him she was either practical or couldn't afford a driver. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back severely and the kind of face that had been pretty once and had traded prettiness for something more durable. She tied the horse herself at the post and walked to the door and knocked with the brisk efficiency of someone who had somewhere else to be. Ronan answered it. He hadn't slept well. He was on his 2nd cup of coffee, and his patience was thin in the particular way it got when he'd been running calculations in his head all night and hadn't liked any of the answers. Mr. Hale, the woman said. My name is Clara Voss. I was Gideon Crow's personal secretary for 9 years. I left his employ 14 months ago. She paused. I'd like to speak with you and Miss Mercer if she's available. I think I have something you need to hear before tomorrow. Ronan looked at her for a moment. He was not by nature a trusting man, and a stranger arriving the morning before the hearing with a convenient story was exactly the kind of thing Gideon would engineer. How did you know to come here, Shams? He asked. Bert Carlo's wife told my sister, Clara Voss said. She held his gaze without flinching. I know how that sounds, but I've been trying to decide whether to do this for 14 months, and I'm here, which ought to count for something. He let her in. Eliza was at the table when they came through to the kitchen, and the look she gave Clara Voss was the same careful, measuring look Ronan had given her at the door. Maisie was in the stable already. She'd taken to going out there before breakfast, which Ronan had quietly stopped questioning because the horses seemed to do something for her that he didn't know how to do yet. Clara Voss sat down. She did not accept coffee. She put her hands flat on the table and looked at both of them and said, without preamble, Gideon kept records. The kitchen went very still. What kind of records? Eliza said. Everything, Clara said. That was how he operated. He believed that knowledge was leverage, and leverage was safety, so he documented everything that gave him an advantage over someone. Transactions, favors, letters he'd intercepted. She looked at Eliza directly. Correspondence he'd redirected. He kept copies. You've seen them, Ronan said. I filed them, she said. For 9 years, I filed documents that I told myself were just administrative, property matters, official correspondence. She looked at her hands on the table. I told myself that for 9 years. And when I left his employ, I kept telling myself that until about 8 months ago, when I heard, through completely unconnected circumstances, that a woman had been raising a child alone in Carver County because the man she was supposed to marry had apparently written her a letter saying he didn't want her anymore. She paused. The timing of that story matched something I'd filed once, a long time ago, and I stopped being able to tell myself it was just administrative. Eliza's voice was very controlled. The copies he kept, are they still in his office? I don't know, Clara said. He may have moved them or destroyed them in the past year since I left, but there's something else. She reached into the bag she'd carried in and withdrew a small envelope. She set it on the table. When I left his employ, I left under difficult circumstances. He owed me wages he refused to pay. I wasn't in a position to force the issue through official channels because official channels in this county go through him. Her jaw tightened briefly. I took something, not as theft, as evidence in case I ever needed it. Ronan looked at the envelope. What's in it? A ledger page, Clara said. Clara. One page, removed from a bound record book he kept in his lower desk drawer. The page covers a 14-month period 12 years ago. It lists, in his handwriting, correspondence handled outside official channels. He wrote it in a shorthand he thought was unreadable. It isn't. She looked at Eliza. Your name appears 4 times. Ronan Hale's name appears 3 times. Each entry has a date and a notation that I can now read and that I believe a handwriting expert could verify. The silence in the kitchen was the kind that has weight. Eliza reached out and picked up the envelope. She opened it carefully and unfolded the page inside. It was small, half a standard page, torn cleanly along one edge where it had been removed from the binding. She looked at it for a long time, and her expression went through something that Ronan watched helplessly because there was nothing he could do about it. She was looking at 12 years of her life, summarized in 7 entries in a small, neat hand. She set it down. She didn't say anything for a moment. This is enough to show intent, Ronan said. He was looking at the page, too. Combined with the original letter and Ruth Alderman's testimony. It's not a court case yet, Clara said, and there was something in her tone that made both of them look at her. Gideon knows you have the original letter. I don't know how he knows, but he does. I got word this morning through my sister, same channel you got word of me, that he spent last night with his attorney and with 3 men who sit on the county review board. He's working the room before the hearing, Eliza said. He's trying to predetermine the outcome, Clara said. He's done it before. He'll frame everything that comes out tomorrow as a personal vendetta. A woman scorned, a man manipulated. He'll be sympathetic and reasonable, and everyone in that room who doesn't know him well will believe him because he's very good at being believed. She looked at Ronan. You need to walk in there tomorrow with something he can't reframe. The letter alone, he'll say it's a forgery you commissioned. The ledger page. He'll say I stole it and fabricated the shorthand translation. Ruth Alderman. He'll attack her memory, Eliza said quietly. Her age. How long ago it was. Yes. Ronan sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling. The problem with a man like Gideon was not that he was powerful. Power was just a thing, and things could be moved. The problem was that he had spent 12 years making himself look reasonable, and reasonable was harder to fight than powerful because it didn't look like something that needed fighting. What would you have us do? Ronan said. Clara Voss looked at him steadily. I'd have you not walk in there alone, she said. I'd have you walk in with every person who has been wronged by that man and is willing to say so in public, because the one thing he cannot manage is volume. He can dismiss one voice. He can dismiss 2. He cannot dismiss a room. Ronan thought about Bert Carlo going home to make 2 telephone calls. He stood up. I need to make some visits today, he said. Clara Voss nodded. She stood too, picked up her bag. I'll be at the hearing tomorrow, she said, with the ledger page. Whatever you think of how I came to have it. She looked at Eliza one more time. The look had something in it that wasn't quite apology and wasn't quite absolution. It was something more complicated, the expression of a woman who knows she waited too long and is here now anyway. I'm sorry it took me this long, she said. Eliza met her eyes. You're here, she said. The same thing Ronan had thought when Clara said it ought to count for something. Eliza had apparently arrived at the same conclusion. Clara left. Ronan heard the buckboard pull away from the post, and he stood at the window for a moment watching the road. Do you believe her? Eliza asked from behind him. I believe the ledger page, he said. The rest, mostly. Mostly is enough for today, she said. He spent the rest of that morning riding, not to his own land, but to neighboring properties, to the houses of men he knew varying degrees of well, men who had their own histories with Gideon Crow's decisions. He didn't make speeches. He didn't need to. He said, I'm going to that hearing tomorrow, and I'm going to tell the truth about what happened to my family. And if you've been wronged by this man, I'd welcome you in the room. Some said no. One man, Harlan Price, who ran a sheep operation on the Western Ridge, looked at his boots and said he couldn't afford the trouble. Ronan told him he understood and meant it. A man with a family and a fragile operation and no guarantee of protection couldn't be blamed for not putting himself in front of a train. But 4 men said yes. Bert Carlo, who Ronan already knew. A man named Sam Okafor, who had lost a mill rights claim 5 years ago that still made him furious when he thought about it. A widow named Dora Haynes, whose late husband had fought a water dispute with Gideon's office for 2 years before dying of a stroke, and who had always believed the stress of it had contributed. And a young farmer named Pete Rourke, who was 26, and should have been too young to have a grievance against a man like Gideon, but had been denied a property transfer on a technicality that everyone at the county office knew was manufactured. 4 people. Plus Clara Voss. Plus Ruth Alderman, who Abel was driving up from Carver County this evening. Not an army, but a room. He got home by early afternoon. Eliza had been busy in a different way while he was gone. She'd gone through everything she had. Every document, every letter copy, every piece of paper she'd brought in that worn leather bag, and organized it in a way that was methodical and clear. She'd made notes in the margin of a piece of paper she'd found in the kitchen. She'd thought through the sequence. She had a mind for this, Ronan was realizing. Not a legal mind exactly, but a strategic one, the kind that came from years of managing alone with limited resources and no room for waste. He'll open the hearing by reading the water rights dispute, she said when he came in. He'll make it about your documentation, not about him. We need to get the letter into the record before he controls the frame of the entire proceeding. Can we do that? If I interrupt, she said. He looked at her. He'll remove you from the room. If he removes me from the room, he does it in front of everyone, she said, and everyone will want to know why. She held his gaze. He's used to people being too afraid to make a scene. He's built his whole authority on the idea that no one will embarrass themselves publicly. Her chin lifted slightly. I'm not afraid of embarrassing myself. I have nothing left to protect that he can take. You have Maisie, Ronan said. Maisie is why I'm doing this, she said. She is not going to grow up watching her mother back down from the man who stole 12 years from our family. Ronan was quiet for a moment. Then, where is she? Stable, Eliza said. She paused. She knows something is happening tomorrow. She hasn't asked me directly. She's going to ask you. How do you know? Eliza smiled very slightly. The first real smile he'd seen from her, not the almost smile from the evening Abel came back, but a real one, brief and complicated. Because she doesn't ask me the things she actually wants to know. She asks me about logistics, what time we're leaving, what she should wear. And then she asks you the real question. She paused again. She's been doing that her whole life, protecting me from the things she thinks will worry me. Ronan absorbed that. An 11-year-old protecting her mother from worry. 11 years of that, probably, picking up on what was too heavy to put down and not knowing how to help, except to not add to it. He went to the stable. Maisie was exactly where he'd expected her. On the hay bale, this time with the Cattleman's Almanac open in her lap. She was reading, genuinely reading, though she looked up when he came in. What time do we leave tomorrow? She asked. 8 o'clock, he said. He sat down on the bale beside her, same as before. So we're there early. She nodded. She looked at the almanac for a moment. Is it dangerous? She said. No, he said. Then, because she deserved honesty, Not physically, but it might be uncomfortable. There might be people who say things that aren't true, and we'll have to sit there and let them finish before we can answer. Maisie considered this with the seriousness she applied to everything. That sounds hard, she said. It is, he said. What things will they say? He thought about how to answer. That your mother came here with a false story, that I'm being taken advantage of. He kept his voice even. That you might not be my daughter. Maisie was quiet for a moment. Then, that's stupid, she said. Anyone can see. He felt something loosen in his chest at that. Not quite laughter, again, but something adjacent to it. Some people need it pointed out to them, he said. Do they, though? She said. Or do they just not want to see it? That was not an 11-year-old's question. That was a question that had been marinating in an 11-year-old's head long enough to become the kind of observation most adults talk themselves out of. The second one, he said. Mostly. She turned a page in the almanac without reading it. Are you scared? She asked. He thought about lying, not to deceive her, but just because it was the reflex. The adult reflex to reassure a child. He decided against it. A little, he said. I don't like things I can't control, and this has a lot of pieces I can't control. Maisie nodded like that was the acceptable answer. Me too, she said. I don't like it either. She paused. But I think you're going to do the right thing. What makes you think that? She closed the almanac. She looked at Fern, who was watching them both over the stall door with the calm attention of a horse who had decided these particular humans were acceptable. Because you filed those papers yesterday, Maisie said. You didn't have to do it the day before everything. You could have waited. But you didn't. She picked at a piece of straw on the cover of the almanac. People who are going to back down don't file papers the day before. Ronan looked at her sideways. She wasn't looking at him. He had the feeling she'd said exactly what she meant and didn't need him to respond to it, so he didn't. They sat in the stable until the light started going gold, and then they went in for supper. Abel arrived with Ruth Alderman at 7 that evening. Ruth was 72, bird-like, with sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and the air of a woman who had maintained extremely precise systems for 50 years and had opinions about people who hadn't. She came in, shook Eliza's hand with both of hers, looked at the letter and the ledger page that were now laid out on the kitchen table, and said without being invited to, I knew something was wrong during those 10 days. I felt it when I came back. The records were right, but they felt wrong, if you understand me. I understand you, Eliza said. This shorthand, Ruth said, touching the ledger page lightly with one finger. May I? She picked it up. She studied it. Her expression shifted through several things. I had a supervisor once who used a system like this. Personal notation. The letters indicate status and the numbers indicate what? She pointed. These entries here, status G, which would mean handled or gone, and the numbers align with routing modifications. She looked up. This man documented what he did to those letters in his own records. Why would someone do that? Cody asked from the corner. He'd come in from the bunkhouse for supper and had ended up staying, listening, which was so like him that no one had remarked on it. Because men like that believe they're untouchable, Ruth said, with the flat certainty of a woman who had watched a certain type of man operate for 7 decades. They keep records because they believe the records are for them, evidence of their own cleverness. She set the page down. It doesn't occur to them that other people can read. That night, the house was full of people in a way it hadn't been since Ronan had moved into it alone years ago and told himself he preferred the quiet. Bert Carlo came by with Sam Okafor to go over the sequence of events and what each of them planned to say. Dora Haynes sent word through Bert that she'd be there at 8. Clara Voss had not come back, but she'd left a note with Abel. I'll be there. Don't worry about me. Maisie fell asleep on the bench in the corner of the sitting room sometime around 9, with the almanac open across her chest, and no one moved her because she looked, in sleep, so completely uncomplicated and young that it seemed wrong to disturb it. Eliza put a blanket over her without waking her and then stood there for a moment looking at her daughter, and Ronan, passing through the room, saw her do it and stopped. He didn't know what impulse made him say it. Maybe just the lateness of the hour and the way the room felt around that sleeping child. "She's going to be all right," he said. Eliza looked at him. Her expression was unguarded in a way he hadn't seen since she'd arrived. The careful control she'd maintained for days was still there, but thinner, permeable, the way people get when they're exhausted and among people they've stopped pretending in front of. "I know," she said. "I've always known that. She's the best thing I ever did." Her voice caught slightly. "I just used to think I'd done it alone, and now I have to recalibrate." She glanced at him. "That's harder than I expected, in both directions." "What does that mean?" he asked quietly. She looked back at Maisie. "It means some part of me is grateful, and another part of me is furious that you weren't there when she learned to walk, and when she got her first fever, and when she decided at age 7 that she would only eat green vegetables if they were cooked and never raw, which is a very specific preference for a 7-year-old. She paused. "And both of those things are true at the same time, and I don't quite know what to do with that." Ronan was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what to do with it either," he said. "The losing those years part." "No," Eliza agreed. "There probably isn't a right thing to do with it." She glanced at him again. "We just have to do the next right thing instead." She went back to the kitchen. He stood in the sitting room for another minute, looking at Maisie, at the almanac rising and falling slowly on her chest, at the gray-green eyes closed, and the face smooth and untroubled the way faces only are in sleep. The morning came fast. They left at 7:50, because Ronan could not make himself wait until 8. Eliza had the letter in a flat leather document case she held against her side. Ruth Alderman rode with Abel. Bert Carlo and Sam Okafor were already at the meeting hall when they arrived, standing outside with 2 other men Ronan didn't know. Bert had made more than 2 calls, it appeared. The county meeting hall was a large wood-frame building that smelled of sawdust and accumulated years of civic decisions. The review board sat at a long table at the front. 3 men, all of whom Ronan knew by sight, and one of whom, Marcus Webb, the center seat, he thought was an honest man, or at least an honest enough one. The other 2 were appointments of Gideon's office, which was a problem. People were filing in. More than Ronan expected. Word had moved through the community in ways he hadn't orchestrated, and now the benches along the walls were filling with people who hadn't been specifically invited by anyone, who had just heard something was happening and wanted to see it. Gideon arrived at 8:15. He came through the side door with his attorney and his 2 ever-present men, and he surveyed the room with the practiced ease of a man walking into a space he expected to control. His eyes moved over the crowd, stopped for a fraction of a second on Ruth Alderman, moved again, more slowly, to Clara Voss, who had come in and was seated in the 3rd row with the ledger page in a folder on her lap. Something shifted in Gideon's face. Very small, very quick. He covered it within a breath with the pleasant expression he always wore in public, but Ronan had been watching him and Ronan had seen it. Gideon had not expected Clara. Gideon had not known she was coming, which meant his information network had failed, which meant the morning was already different from the one he'd prepared for. Marcus Webb called the hearing to order. He began reading the formal statement of purpose, water rights review, documentation irregularities, etc., in the dry monotone of a man doing procedural work, and Ronan sat in the front row with Eliza on his left and Maisie on his right, and he watched Gideon at the other end of the room smiling his pleasant smile at the board members, and he thought, "You don't know yet how wrong your calculations are." Gideon's attorney rose to present the case against Ronan's water rights. He was smooth, well-prepared, used language that sounded like it was about documentation and was actually about character. He suggested, in careful language, that recent events at the Hale Ranch, an unannounced arrival, unverified claims, an expedited paternity filing, raised questions about Mr. Hale's judgment and the integrity of his record-keeping operation more broadly. Ronan kept his hands still on his knees. He heard Maisie shift very slightly beside him. She'd caught the implication, and without thinking about it, he put his hand on the bench beside her, not touching her, just there, and she leaned half an inch toward him and stayed. The attorney concluded. Marcus Webb cleared his throat and looked out at the room, and Eliza stood up. "I have evidence relevant to this proceeding," she said clearly. Her voice did not shake. It also wasn't loud. It was the voice of a woman who had spent 2 years deciding whether to do this and had arrived at the decision so completely that there was no room left in her for trembling. "I am asking the board to hear it before any ruling is made." Gideon's attorney started to object. Marcus Webb held up one hand, and the attorney stopped, and Webb looked at Eliza with the expression of a man who had been presiding over a hearing for 40 minutes and had just understood it was a different hearing than the one he'd been told to expect. "Present your evidence, ma'am," he said. Eliza opened the document case. She took out 2 letters, the original and the forgery. She walked to the board table and set them down side by side. 12 years ago, she said, these 2 letters were exchanged. One was written by Ronan Hale and never received by me. One was written by someone else and presented to me as being from Ronan Hale." She looked at the board, then briefly across the room at Gideon. "The difference in handwriting is evident to the naked eye, but I also have 2 additional pieces of evidence: a ledger entry in the handwriting of the man who intercepted this correspondence, and an eyewitness who can speak to the timeline of that interception." The room made a sound, not a loud sound. The specific sound a large group of people makes when something has just become real to all of them at once. Gideon Crow sat very still. His pleasant smile remained on his face. He was still wearing it. He was a man who had worn that smile through a great many difficult situations, and it had served him well, and he was not going to stop wearing it now just because a woman had stood up with 2 letters and a voice that didn't shake. But his hands, Ronan noticed, were no longer on the table. They were in his lap, out of sight. And across the room, Clara Voss was opening her folder, and Ruth Alderman was straightening in her chair, and Bert Carlo and Sam Okafor and Dora Haynes and Pete Rourke were all sitting in that room, and Marcus Webb was leaning forward over those 2 letters with the expression of a man who has just realized the next hour of his life is going to require every bit of integrity he possesses. Gideon's attorney leaned over to his client and said something in a low voice. Gideon said something back. Whatever it was, the attorney's expression tightened, and he sat back and wrote something on the papers in his lap. Ronan watched all of it. He watched the room. He watched the board. He watched Gideon Crow sitting across that hall with his hands out of sight and his smile still in place, and he thought about a letter written 12 years ago that had never arrived, and a girl who had grown up without a father, and 12 years of not knowing, and the particular feeling that comes when something stolen from you is not yet returned but is at last within reach. Marcus Webb picked up the first letter. He held it at arm's length, the way older men do when they're reading without their glasses handy, then thought better of it and put his glasses on. He read it. Then he picked up the second letter and read that. He set them down side by side and looked at them for a long moment without speaking. The room was so quiet that Ronan could hear the man behind him breathing. "These are purportedly from the same hand," Webb said. He was not asking. He was thinking out loud, which was something Ronan had come to appreciate about Marcus Webb in the 40 minutes since the hearing had begun. The man thought in public. He didn't posture. He just worked through things. "The handwriting is different." "Significantly different," Eliza said. She was still standing. She hadn't sat back down after presenting the letters, and no one had told her to. "I can speak to that because I've seen Ronan Hale's handwriting on other correspondence. The letter on the left is his. The letter on the right is not." Gideon's attorney rose. He was a compact man named Fielding, with silver hair and the particular brand of professional smoothness that came from never having lost a case in a county where the most important man always made sure you didn't. "With respect to the board," Fielding said, "we have no way to verify the provenance of either document. The claimant could have obtained a genuine letter from Mr. Hale at any point over the past 12 years, and is now presenting it alongside a document she herself prepared." "That is not what happened," Eliza said. She said it without heat, without turning to look at Fielding, just said it into the middle of the room like a fact that didn't require defending. "Miss Mercer," Webb said, "let me ask you directly. How did you come to be in possession of what you're calling the original letter?" "I found it in Gideon Crow's office," she said, 2 years ago, in a locked drawer in his private desk. The sound the room made this time was louder. Webb looked across at Gideon. "Mr. Crow, do you have a response to that?" Gideon stood. He uncrossed his legs and stood and buttoned his jacket and smiled at Marcus Webb with the calm of a man who had survived worse than this by simply refusing to acknowledge that anything was wrong. "I do," he said. His voice was warm, reasonable, the voice of a man explaining something unfortunate to someone he liked. "That letter, if it exists, if it's what she claims, I have no knowledge of it. I've had a great many documents pass through my office over the years. It's possible something was misfiled. It's possible someone on my staff at some point received a piece of correspondence incorrectly." He spread his hands. "But to suggest that I, deliberately, interfered with private correspondence between two individuals 12 years ago for some personal motive," he let the sentence trail off, let the implicit absurdity of it hang there. "I'd ask the board to consider the source of this accusation. A woman who has, by her own account, spent 12 years in another county, who arrived here 1 week ago with a child and a story and a document she claims to have retrieved from my private office without my knowledge." He tilted his head. "If she was in my office without my knowledge, that is itself a legal matter. It was good. Ronan had to acknowledge it was good. The way Gideon repositioned everything, the victim, the aggrieved party, the man being accused by someone who had committed her own transgression. If Ronan had been watching this without knowing the truth, he might have been persuaded." Webb was looking at Eliza. "Ms. Mercer, how did you access his private office?" "I was there on county business," she said. "I had a matter regarding a property title in Carver County that fell under this commissioner's jurisdiction. I was escorted to the office and left to wait. He keeps his desk unlocked when he believes he has nothing to fear." She paused. The drawer was not locked. I opened it. The letter was in a bound correspondence file with my name written on the tab. A file with her name on the tab. Ronan had not known that detail. He watched Webb's face register it and then carefully not react, which was itself a reaction. "A file with your name," Webb repeated. "Yes," Eliza said. "Mr. Crow," Webb said, without looking away from Eliza, "do you maintain personal correspondence files in your office desk?" "I maintain a great many administrative files," Gideon said, "as any diligent official would." "With individuals' names on the tabs?" A very slight pause. "For ongoing county matters, yes." "And Miss Mercer had an ongoing county matter in your jurisdiction." "Apparently she believes she did," Gideon said. The warmth in his voice had not cooled exactly, but it had changed quality, like something being kept at a temperature by effort rather than nature. Webb turned to the other two board members. They exchanged a look. The one on Webb's left, a younger man named Dodd, whose appointment Ronan had always been uncertain about, was writing something down. The one on Webb's right was looking at Gideon with an expression that was not quite what it had been 20 minutes ago. "I'd like to hear from the other witnesses Ms. Mercer mentioned," Webb said. Fielding objected again. Webb overruled him with the brevity of a man who had made his decision and didn't need to discuss it. Ruth Alderman stood up from the third row. She moved to the front of the room with the careful, deliberate steps of a woman who had been sitting on hard benches for 40 minutes and whose joints had opinions about it. But she stood straight when she got there, and she looked at the board with the clear eyes of someone who had absolutely nothing to hide and had never had anything to hide and considered that her best credential. She explained who she was. She explained her work at the Carver County Postal Office. She explained the system she'd maintained and what the records showed about the period in question and the 10 days she'd been absent. She spoke without notes, from memory, with the precise recall of someone who had organized information as a vocation for 30 years. "The records for those 10 days show correct procedure," she said, "but the handling notes for two specific pieces of outgoing correspondence, one addressed to an R. Hale at a rural route address in this county, and one incoming address to an E. Mercer at a Carver County address, show a routing notation I didn't write and didn't recognize when I returned. I assumed at the time it was a colleague's variation. I've thought about it many times since." "What did the notation indicate?" Webb asked. "It indicated the item had been collected," Ruth said, "but not by the intended recipient." The room processed that. "Collected by whom?" Webb asked. "The notation didn't specify," Ruth said, "which is irregular. In my system, all collections were logged with the collector's name. That notation was incomplete, which is why I noticed it and why I remember it. Gideon's attorney began to say something about the fallibility of memory over long periods. Ruth turned and looked at him with an expression that suggested she had eaten more formidable opponents than him for breakfast during her working years, and he trailed off. "My memory is not the issue," Ruth said pleasantly. "I kept a personal log. I kept one for 40 years, every working day." She reached into the bag she'd brought and withdrew a small cloth-bound notebook, worn at the corners and soft with age. She opened it to a page she'd marked. "I note anomalies at the end of each workday. The entry for my return from illness reads, 'Found 2 routing anomalies in the correspondence handled during my absence. Items appear delivered, but collection signatures incomplete. Spoke to Collins about the handling procedure, but he was vague.'" She closed the notebook. Collins was the colleague who covered my absence. He left the position 4 months later. "Do you know where Collins is now?" Webb asked. "He passed away," Ruth said. 8 years ago." A pause. "However, I also note in that same entry that the anomalous items were associated with a rural route address in the next county, a name I didn't recognize at the time. Hale." She looked at the board. "I recognized it this week." The room was very still. Webb looked at the letters on the table in front of him. Then he looked up at the room, at the people along the walls, the crowded benches, the faces. He was reading the temperature of something. Ronan had seen that look before on the faces of men who understood that the thing in front of them was larger than the official parameters of the proceeding. "I'd like to hear from one more witness," Webb said. "Ms. Voss?" Clara walked to the front. She held the folder with both hands, not from nervousness but from care, the way you hold something that matters. She explained who she was. 9 years in Gideon's employment. She explained the nature of her work: filing, correspondence, administrative management. She explained why she'd left, which was wages owed, and a dispute she hadn't had the resources to pursue officially. Then she opened the folder and presented the ledger page. She explained the shorthand. She walked through it entry by entry, slowly, clearly, with the focused patience of someone who had prepared this explanation many times in her head and was now simply delivering it. 7 entries, 7 dates, initials that corresponded to names, status notations, routing modifications. The entry dated, she gave the date, and it fell into the room like a stone into water, reads in full, EM to RH, status G, route modified, file, which in the notation system he used means correspondence from E. Mercer to R. Hale, handled and removed from standard routing, filed in personal records. She turned the page slightly toward the board. The following entry 3 days later, RH to EM, status G, route modified, substitute issued, file, which means correspondence from R. Hale to E. Mercer, removed from routing, a substitute document issued, filed in personal records. Substitute document issued. Ronan heard those 3 words and something in his chest went cold and then very hot. A substitute document. Gideon had written it down. He had documented the forgery in his own hand in his own record because he had never, not for one moment, believed anyone would ever see it. The room had stopped making any sound at all. Fielding stood up. He was not smooth anymore. The smoothness had cracked, and underneath it was the expression of a man who had walked into a building that was on fire and had only just realized it. The board cannot accept a document that was obtained by an admitted unauthorized removal from a private office, he said. His voice was still controlled, but it was controlled the way a man controls his voice when he is frightened. Whatever this document purports to show, the means by which it was obtained— "I'd like to address that," Clara said. She did not raise her voice. She looked at Fielding with the calm of someone who had anticipated this objection so many times it had lost its ability to alarm her. "I did not remove this document from a government office. I removed it from a private desk in a private office, during the process of retrieving my own personal belongings upon my departure from employment, items which I was entitled to retrieve." She looked at the board. "The ledger is the personal property of Gideon Crow, not of the county commissioner's office. It contains no county business. It is a private record of private actions. And I took it because I was owed wages, and I was afraid, and I thought someday I might need it." She folded her hands. Someday is today. Marcus Webb looked at Gideon. Gideon had not moved. He was still standing. The smile was still on his face. Ronan had to give him credit for the smile. It was extraordinary, the staying power of that smile. But it was doing something different now. It was no longer the expression of a man who was in control of the room. It was the expression of a man who was working very hard to look like a man who is in control of the room, and the difference was visible, at least to people who were watching closely. "Mr. Crow," Webb said, "this ledger entry, is this your handwriting?" Gideon looked at the page. He looked at it for longer than a man looks at something he's never seen before. "I cannot identify a document I am seeing for the first time under these circumstances," he said, "and I would strongly suggest that this proceeding is being manipulated by a coordinated campaign of fabricated evidence, personal grievance, and a decade-old emotional dispute that has nothing to do with the matter this board was convened to address." "Then let's address the matter the board was convened to address," Webb said. His voice had changed. Not harsh, not dramatic, just different. The change a voice makes when a man has made up his mind and is now moving in that direction. "The water rights claim against Mr. Hale. It was filed by this office." He looked at Gideon. "Your office filed this claim. On the basis of documented irregularities based on documentation that I have now been presented with substantial reason to believe was fabricated or manipulated," Webb said, "by the same office that filed the claim." He looked at Dodd on his left, and then at the man on his right. "I'd like to call a brief recess before we proceed." They went to a side room. The three board members and their clerk, and the door closed behind them. The main room exhaled. Gideon sat down. First time he'd sat since he'd stood to respond to Eliza. His attorney leaned over him and they talked in low voices, and Gideon's face, for the first time, was doing something unmanaged. Not breaking down. Nothing as dramatic as that. Just moving. The muscles under the skin moving in ways they usually didn't because the face was no longer being curated. Ronan stayed in his seat. Eliza sat beside him. He could feel her arm against his. Not holding on to each other. Just present. Just there. The minimal contact of two people who have held themselves upright through something difficult and are still holding. Maisie leaned close and said very quietly, "Is it working?" "Yes," Ronan said. She nodded. She sat back. She looked across the room at Gideon with an expression that was not triumph and was not hate and was something harder to name. The expression of a child who has understood something adult and is not sure yet what to do with the understanding. Bert Carlo appeared at Ronan's shoulder from 2 rows back. "Webb's going to come back and dismiss the water claim," Bert said quietly. "But that's not enough. The man needs to answer for what he did." "That's a different proceeding," Ronan said. "Which somebody needs to start," Bert said. "Somebody will," Ronan said. The board came back in 11 minutes. Webb sat down and arranged his papers with the neat movements of a man buying himself one more moment to be certain. Then he looked up. "The water rights claim filed against Ronan Hale is dismissed," he said. "The documentation supporting the claim has been called into significant question, and the board finds insufficient basis to proceed." He paused. "Additionally, this board is formally referring the evidence presented today, the letters, the ledger page, the witness testimony poem, to the Territorial Investigation Office for review." He looked at Gideon. "That referral includes a request for an independent review of the Commissioner's Office records for the period in question." Fielding started to speak. "That's not a ruling you can object to," Webb said, with a patience that had a very hard floor under it. "It is a referral. It is within the board's authority. And it is done." Gideon stood. He straightened his jacket. He looked at Webb with the smile still in place. Thinner now, more structural than emotional, like a building after the interior has been gutted. And he said, "I'm disappointed in this proceeding. I intend to make my concerns known through appropriate channels." "You're welcome to," Webb said. Gideon walked out. His attorney followed. His 2 men followed. The door closed. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sam Okafor, from 3 rows back, said quietly, "He's going to run." "He can't run far enough," Bert said. Ronan was not sure that was true. Men like Gideon had resources and connections and the kind of practiced self-belief that could carry them a very long way. But the referral was on record now. The letters were on record. Ruth Alderman's testimony and Clara Voss's testimony were on record. Things that were on record had a way of following people. Eliza turned to him. She was not crying. She looked like someone who had been expecting to cry and had discovered, in the moment, that she was too tired and too hollow and too relieved all at once for tears. "It's not over," she said. "No," he said. "But the piece that was most dangerous to you is over." She nodded. She pressed her lips together. She looked down at her hands in her lap for a moment, at the document case resting across her knees, and then she looked up and across the room at Maisie, who was talking to Ruth Alderman with the serious, attentive focus she brought to conversations with older people who knew things she didn't. "She's going to have questions," Eliza said. "I know," Ronan said. "Let her ask them." They filed out into the morning. People stopped them in the road outside the hall. Not everyone. And not all of them were warm, because in any community, some people align themselves with the powerful until the very moment the powerful fall and then realign with speed and smoothness they will later pretend was always their position. But enough people. Dora Haynes gripped Eliza's hand in both of hers and said something too quiet for Ronan to hear, and Eliza nodded. Pete Rourke shook Ronan's hand and said he hoped what happened today was the beginning of getting his own situation looked at, and Ronan said he thought it probably was. Clara Voss found them on the steps. She looked more tired than she had inside, the particular tired that comes after adrenaline lets go. "Thank you," Eliza said to her. Clara shook her head slightly. "Don't thank me for doing what I should have done a year ago, or 9 years ago." She paused. "But you're welcome." She walked away down the street without looking back, which was also her right. Ruth Alderman hugged Eliza briefly and firmly, in the manner of a woman who does not hug people often, but means it thoroughly when she does. Abel helped her back to the buckboard with the patient care he brought to most things. Ruth looked back once from the seat and gave Ronan a look that said she'd done what she came to do and she was satisfied, and then Abel clicked to the horse and they moved off. Bert Carlo stayed. He stood with Ronan on the steps while the crowd dispersed, and the morning went back to being a regular morning in a way that felt slightly unreal after the last 2 hours. "The investigation," Bert said. "It'll take time." "I know," Ronan said, "and he'll fight it, every step." "I know that too." Bert was quiet for a moment. "But it'll happen," he said. Not a question, a thing he was deciding to believe. "It'll happen," Ronan said. Bert nodded and went to his horse. Maisie appeared at Ronan's side. She'd been talking to Ruth until the buckboard left, and now she was here, standing next to him, watching the last of the crowd move down the road. "Ruth knows a lot about mail," Maisie said. "She does," Ronan agreed. "She said the mail system is only as honest as the people running it." Maisie paused. "I thought that was about more than mail." "It was," Ronan said. She was quiet for a moment. "The man who left," she said, "he looked like he thought it wasn't really happening to him." Ronan looked at her. She was watching the road where Gideon had gone. "People like that usually do," he said. Maisie thought about this. Is that why they do things like that? Because they don't think it's really happening to other people either? He didn't have a quick answer for that. He thought about it honestly, the way she deserved. "Some of them," he said finally, "some of them know exactly what they're doing to other people and just think they're more important. And some of them have told themselves a story about it for so long that they believe their own version." He paused. "I'm not sure which one he is." "I think the second one," Maisie said. "He didn't look guilty in there. He looked surprised, like the rules had changed without warning." Ronan looked at her, at the absolute seriousness of the observation on the face of an 11-year-old who had been in that room for 2 hours watching everything. "You're going to be something," he said. He hadn't meant to say it out loud. It just came out. Maisie glanced at him sideways. "Mom says that too," she said. She says it like she's not sure if it's a compliment. "It is," he said, "from both of us." She almost smiled. It was the closest she'd come to a real unguarded smile since she'd arrived. It moved through her expression and then pulled back, but it had been there briefly, and it was real. Eliza came to stand with them. She looked at the road. at the dispersing morning, at the ordinary town doing its ordinary things around an extraordinary 2 hours that had just passed through it. Now what? She said. She meant it practically, the immediate logistics of the day. But the question also had the feeling of something larger in it. Now we go home, Ronan said. He had said that word without planning it. Home. He hadn't said it with any implication or weight. It had just come out as the accurate word for where they were going, and he felt both of them register it and not say anything about it, and that was the right response. They walked to where he'd tied the horses. Maisie went ahead, the way children do when they feel the social weight of adult conversations about to happen and would rather be near the horses. The investigation will be slow, Eliza said quietly. Yes, Ronan said. He might not be removed from office for months, or longer. Probably not, he agreed. And in the meantime, he still has power to make things difficult. He does, Ronan said, but he used his best move today, the water rights. That was meant to be the thing that broke us. He looked at her. We're not broken. She held his gaze. She was doing the thing she did where she assessed what someone said for the truth content before accepting it. He'd come to recognize it in the past week. He also recognized that when she finished the assessment and found something solid, she accepted it completely, without hedging. No, she said, we're not. They rode home in the late morning light. Maisie rode beside Ronan on a borrowed horse, Cody's horse actually, who was calmer than the others and had a tolerant personality. Maisie sat well in the saddle for someone who had never ridden until 5 days ago. She didn't overhandle the reins. She watched where the horse's ears were pointing and adjusted accordingly, which was something most people had to be taught, and she had figured out by watching. Halfway home, she said, without apparent context, I want to learn to ride properly, not just sitting, actually ride. I'll teach you, Ronan said. She nodded like the matter was settled, which it was. They came around the bend in the road that cut through the lower pasture, the same road, the same bend, where 10 days ago a dusty carriage had appeared and Ronan had stood at the fence with a cold cup of coffee and had not known that his life was about to reorganize entirely around a fact he hadn't known existed. The ranch looked the same as it always did. The cattle were where they were supposed to be. The stable stood with its door open the way it always stood. The fence line he'd checked 100 times ran straight and intact across the near pasture. It looked exactly the same and was also completely different, and Ronan sat on his horse at the gate for a moment before he opened it, looking at what he'd built over 12 years, the years he'd built it alone and angry and not entirely knowing what he was building it toward, and he thought that maybe that was the thing about time that was most hard to account for. You couldn't always know, while you were in it, what it was building toward. You just had to keep building. He opened the gate. They rode through. The investigation took 4 months. Ronan had told Bert it would happen, and he'd believed it when he said it, but believing something and living through the waiting of it are two entirely different things. 4 months is a long time when the man who stole your life is still sitting in his office 2 miles away, still signing documents, still receiving visitors who don't yet know what he is. Ronan drove past the commissioner's building twice a week on regular business, and twice a week he looked at the window with the lamp in it and felt something he was not proud of. Not fear exactly, more like the specific frustration of knowing a thing is true and watching the world take its time catching up to that truth. Gideon did not run. That surprised people, including Ronan. Bert had predicted it the day of the hearing, and Sam Okafor had agreed, and even Eliza had said quietly that she thought he might disappear before the territory investigators arrived. But Gideon stayed. He went to his office. He attended the monthly civic dinner. He was seen at the barbershop on Thursday mornings, same as always. He had decided, apparently, that the best defense was to behave as though nothing had changed, and Ronan understood the logic of it even while it made him want to put his fist through something. The territorial investigators arrived 6 weeks after the hearing. 2 of them from the capital, with the careful neutrality of men who had been sent to find out what happened rather than to confirm what anyone had already decided. Ronan met with them for 3 hours. Eliza met with them for 4. Clara Voss met with them twice. Ruth Alderman sent a written statement that ran to 11 pages, which was exactly what Ronan would have expected from Ruth Alderman. During those 6 weeks, life at the ranch continued in the way life continues whether or not the larger situation has been resolved, because cattle don't wait on investigations, and Fenceline doesn't care about the status of your legal proceedings, and the first frost of the season arrived on a Thursday morning at the end of October without any regard whatsoever for the Hale family's ongoing difficulties. Maisie had started school. There was a schoolhouse 4 miles down the road, a one-room building with a teacher named Mrs. Farrow, who was in her 30s and had the particular gift of some teachers for making children feel that learning was a thing they'd chosen rather than a thing being done to them. Maisie had walked in on the first day with the expression of a person prepared to be unimpressed, and had come home that afternoon with 3 questions about local geology that Mrs. Farrow had suggested she look into further. And she'd come to Ronan with those questions because she'd already worked out that he knew this land better than anyone. He'd sat with her at the kitchen table for 2 hours that first evening, answering those questions and then following the threads of them into other questions she hadn't asked yet, but was clearly about to. Eliza had made coffee and sat nearby, not participating. Just present, just there. And at some point Ronan had looked up from the almanac they'd spread open between them and caught Eliza watching them with an expression he didn't have a word for, something that was made of loss and relief in proportions that shifted as you looked at it. He'd looked back down at the almanac. Some moments didn't need to be acknowledged out loud. Maisie was not, it turned out, easy. Ronan had not expected easy. He'd have been suspicious of easy. But the specific texture of not easy she presented was something he had to learn. She didn't fight him directly. She didn't slam doors or raise her voice. What she did was go quiet in a particular way when she disagreed with something, a quality of quiet that was clearly communicating disagreement without stating it, and if you didn't notice it and adjust, it calcified into something harder to reach. He noticed it the 3rd week when he'd told her she couldn't ride out to the east pasture alone. He'd said it reasonably, with a reason attached. The east pasture fence had a gap he hadn't repaired yet, and he didn't want her near cattle through a broken fence without an adult. She'd said okay, and had gone to the stable, and he'd gone back to work, and by evening, something was off, and he hadn't known what until Eliza said, at supper, with the mild tone of someone who had been observing this for 11 years, "She thinks you don't trust her judgment." "She's 11, Ronan said. "She knows that," Eliza said. "She also knows she's careful, and she was looking at that fence gap yesterday, and she knew it was a problem before you told her." She paused. "She doesn't need you to agree with every decision you make. She needs you to explain the real reason." "I gave her the real reason," Ronan said. Eliza looked at him. "You gave her the safety reason. The real reason is that the east pasture is a long way from the house, and you've spent 3 weeks trying not to let yourself think about the 11 years where something could have happened to her, and you didn't know she existed." She set down her fork. "Those are different reasons." He had nothing to say to that because she was right. He found Maisie in the stable, on the hay bale, with a book that was not the almanac this time. A novel, something Mrs. Farrow had apparently recommended. She looked up when he came in. He sat beside her. He said, "I didn't explain myself right earlier." She waited. "The fence is part of it," he said. "But the real part is that I've known you for 3 weeks, and I spent 11 years not knowing you were alive, and I'm still working out what to do with that. So sometimes I'm going to be overcautious, and it's not about your judgment, it's about mine." Maisie looked at him for a long moment. "That's more honest," she said. "I'm trying," he said. She considered. "I'll tell you when I think something's overcautious," she said, "and you can tell me when you think I'm underestimating a risk. And we can argue about it." "That works," he said. She opened her book again, which was her way of indicating the conversation was complete and she was satisfied with the outcome. He sat beside her for another minute before he went back to the house, and he thought, this is what it is to be a parent. Not the large moments, the negotiated ones. Eliza was still at the kitchen table when he came back in. She was writing a letter, which she'd been doing more of lately, corresponding with people she'd lost contact with during the years of managing alone in Carver County, rebuilding the social connections that get expensive when you're a single mother on a tight budget and can't always reciprocate invitations. "Better?" she said, without looking up. "Better," he said. She nodded and kept writing. This was another thing he was learning, and this one was more complicated than the negotiations with Maisie because it had 12 years and a great deal of unresolved feeling behind it. He and Eliza lived in the same house, and he was still learning how to be in a room with her without one of two things happening. Either the careful, formal distance of two people who have decided not to make assumptions, or the occasional moment when the distance collapsed entirely and some echo of what they'd been to each other surfaced without warning and had to be navigated. They had not talked, directly, about what came next for them. Not as two people. They'd talked about Maisie and the investigation and the ranch and the practical logistics of three people sharing a living space. They had not talked about the fact that he still knew, in whatever part of a person is below strategy and caution, that she was the woman he'd been going to build a life with. And he had no idea whether 12 years and the specific damage of what Gideon had done had changed what was underneath her careful exterior, or whether something of what they'd had was still there, still viable, or whether he was reading something into proximity and shared crisis that wasn't real. He had decided, not going to rush it. He was 41 years old, and he had spent 12 years alone, and he knew the difference between patience and avoidance. He was choosing patience. Some things needed time to establish whether they were real, and this was one of them. The investigators submitted their preliminary report 8 weeks after the hearing. Ronan was not shown the report, but Webb, who had become, in a quiet, understated way, something of an ally, told him that it was substantial, and that Gideon's attorney had been summoned to the Capitol for a meeting that had apparently lasted most of a day. 3 weeks after that, Gideon Crow was formally suspended from the commissioner's office pending a full review. Ronan heard this from Abel, who had heard it from the feed store owner, who had been standing outside the postal office when the official notice was posted on the public board at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday morning. He came and told Ronan while Ronan was fixing the east pasture fence. He'd gotten to it finally, worked on it 2 days. It was solid now. And Ronan put down the post driver and stood in the cold pasture air and just breathed for a moment. "You all right?" Abel asked. "Yeah," Ronan said. Yeah. He told Eliza that evening. She was chopping vegetables for supper, and she stopped when he said it and stood with the knife in her hand looking at the cutting board for a moment. "Suspended," she said. "Pending full review," he said, which, based on what I understand about what the investigators found, is going to go one direction. She set the knife down. She turned around. Her eyes were bright in a way she was clearly not going to do anything about. And she didn't. She just let them be bright and looked at him. "It's not enough," she said. "It won't ever be enough for what he took." "No," Ronan agreed. "But it's something." "It's something," he said. She turned back to the cutting board. She picked up the knife. She chopped 2 more carrots, and then her shoulders did something, some movement that wasn't quite a shudder and wasn't quite a sigh, a physical release of something that had been held in a long time, and Ronan stood in the kitchen doorway and let her have it privately because that was what the moment called for. Maisie found out the next morning, at school. One of the other children had heard their parents discussing it and told her, with the blunt, pure directness of children who haven't yet learned to cushion information, "That's the man who messed up your parents, right? He's getting fired?" She came home and reported this to Ronan with the same bluntness and added, "I told her he's getting investigated, not fired. She didn't know the difference." "Do you know the difference?" Ronan asked. "Investigated means they're making sure they have everything right before they decide," Maisie said. "Fired is just fired." "That's right," Ronan said. She hung up her coat on the peg by the door, which she'd started doing automatically now, no longer looking for where things went because she'd learned where they went. "Will he go to jail?" she asked. Ronan considered whether to soften this. He decided against it. "I don't know," he said. "He might. There are laws that cover what he did, but he has money and lawyers, and the law moves slowly." He paused. "What I can tell you for certain is that he's not going to be in that office anymore. He's not going to make decisions about people's water and their land and their correspondence." He looked at her. "He can't do to anyone else what he did to us." Maisie absorbed this. She nodded, once, with the particular quality of nod she had when she was accepting something that wasn't everything she wanted but was real. "Okay," she said, and went to change out of her school clothes. The formal removal from office came 6 weeks later. The investigator's full report ran to many pages that Ronan never saw, but that Webb described to him over coffee as comprehensive and damning. covering not only the correspondence interception, but 3 separate instances of land claims manipulation, 2 water rights decisions made on the basis of private financial arrangements, and a pattern of behavior stretching back further than anyone had realized. Gideon Crow was removed from office. His decisions under review, his cases subject to reinvestigation. His attorney announced they would be contesting. Everyone expected that. No one expected it to stop anything. The day the removal was official, Bert Carlo came over uninvited with a bottle of something that had been aging in his barn for 8 years, and Sam Okafor and Pete Rourke came with him. And Dora Haynes sent a pie rather than coming herself because she was not a person who celebrated out loud, but she wanted to contribute. They sat on Ronan's porch in the November cold, and Bert poured the whiskey into whatever cups were available, and they sat with it for a while before anyone spoke. "He'll still be around," Sam Okafor said. He had a direct way of saying the uncomfortable thing that Ronan had come to appreciate. Contesting. His people are still around. This county doesn't forget itself overnight. "No," Ronan agreed. "But it shifts," Bert said. "That's the thing. It shifts. You take one man down who everyone thought was untouchable, and the whole atmosphere shifts. People stop assuming, start asking questions they were afraid to ask before." He sipped his whiskey. "That's worth something." "It's worth a lot," Pete Rourke said. He was young enough to still believe in the clean version of justice and old enough, after his own experience, to know it rarely arrived clean. He was sitting with both beliefs at once, which Ronan thought was actually the right place to land. Eliza came out with her own cup and sat on the porch step below the men's chairs, and Bert poured for her without being asked, which was its own kind of acceptance. She looked out at the darkening pasture and didn't say much, just sat with the cup in her hands. Later, when the visitors had gone and Maisie was in bed and the house was quiet, Ronan and Eliza did the dishes the way they'd taken to doing them together. Not because it required 2 people, just because it had become the habit of the quiet end of the day. He washed, she dried, and they didn't always talk. Tonight they didn't talk for a while. Then Eliza said, "I've been thinking about what comes next." He kept washing. "For who?" "For me," she said. "And Maisie." She paused. "I've been here almost 4 months. I've been telling myself we're here for the investigation, that we'd leave when it was resolved." She dried a cup and set it on the shelf. "It's resolved now, more or less." Ronan stopped washing. He didn't turn around. He looked at the water in the basin. "And?" he said. "And I don't know what I'm doing," she said. Her voice was honest in the way it got when she wasn't managing it, which was increasingly often. "I know what Maisie wants. She doesn't say it, but I know. She's put roots here in 4 months in a way she never did in Carver County in 11 years. She knows where the hay is stored, and she has a horse she considers hers and a teacher she respects, and she comes home talking about things." A pause. "She comes home talking. She didn't used to do that." "What do you want?" Ronan asked. He turned around now. He looked at her. Eliza met his eyes. She held a dish towel in her hands, both hands, and she was doing the assessment thing, looking at him to find out whether the question was safe to answer honestly. Whatever she found, she answered. "I want to stay," she said, "but I'm not going to stay the way we've been. In the same house, as if we're just sharing a problem. That's not fair to either of us." She held his gaze. "I don't know what we are anymore, Ronan. I know what we were. I know what we were supposed to be, but 12 years happened and they happened to both of us, and we're not the same people." "No," he said. "So I don't know." She set the dish towel on the counter. "I just know that I'm tired of not saying the honest thing because the timing is wrong, or the situation is too complicated, or there's too much happening." She looked at him steadily. "There's always going to be something happening." He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her. At the lines at the corners of her eyes, and the gray beginning at her temples, and the careful and not so careful parts of her face, the combination of the woman he'd known and the woman she'd become in the years between, which were not the same woman and were also not entirely different. "I'm not the same either," he said. "I spent 12 years being angry without knowing what I was angry about. I built this place with that anger, and it worked. It's a good ranch, but there's something in me that's harder than it should probably be." "I know," she said. "I can see it." "And you're still here," he said. She looked at him. Something shifted in her expression. "I'm still here," she said. He picked up the dish towel she'd set down and finished drying the bowl he'd washed. He put it on the shelf. "Stay," he said. "Not as something we need to define right now. Just stay. Let's see what we are when we're not in the middle of something." Eliza was quiet for a moment, then, "That's not a romantic proposition." "No," he said. "It's an honest one." She almost smiled. It went all the way this time. It was small and complicated and real, and it reached her eyes. "Okay," she said. Winter settled over the ranch with the serious commitment of a frontier winter that meant it. The pipes along the north side of the house froze in January, and Ronan and Maisie spent a Saturday morning with heat sources and patience solving the problem, while Eliza made an enormous pot of soup that lasted 3 days. The cattle needed more tending in the cold, and Maisie helped with the morning feeding before school without being asked, which Ronan noticed and didn't comment on because commenting would have made it a thing, and it worked better as just a fact. In February, a letter arrived from the capital. The territorial investigation had concluded its main findings. Gideon Crow was formally charged with abuse of office, corruption of the postal communication process, and fraudulent manipulation of county records. His attorney was filing objections. The process would take more time, but the charges existed, on paper, official, and that was the thing that could not be undone. Ronan read the letter twice and left it on the table and went out to check on the cattle. When he came back in, Maisie was at the table doing schoolwork. She glanced at the letter and then at him. "Charges," she said. "Yes." "Official ones." "Official ones," he said. She looked back at her schoolwork. "Good," she said, in the flat, certain tone she used when something was exactly what it should be. She turned a page. "Can you help me with this geography problem when you have a minute?" He hung up his coat and pulled out a chair. "I've got a minute now," he said. Spring came the way it always came to that part of the country. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by a cold snap. Frost on the grass one morning and mud the next. The cattle restless and the horses eager in the ways animals are when the season turns. The east pasture fence, newly solid, held through the worst of the mud season. The creek that supplied the eastern water access ran clean and full and unchallenged. It was April when Ronan and Eliza went to the riverside. Not planned exactly. They'd taken to walking in the evenings when the weather allowed, sometimes together, sometimes with Maisie. Sometimes Maisie rode Fern along the creek path while they walked. This particular evening, Maisie had declined. She had a school project due and had set herself up at the kitchen table with a stack of reference books and the focused expression that meant she did not want to be interrupted. And so they had walked alone for the first time in a while. The river ran alongside the southern boundary of the ranch property. There was a particular bend in it, a broad, shallow curve where the water slowed and the bank was flat and grassy, that Ronan had always found himself coming to when he needed to think. He hadn't realized until they were standing there that this was the place he'd wanted to bring something to for 12 years without knowing what. They stood at the bank. The water moved past with the quiet confidence of water that has been moving and will keep moving regardless of whatever happens on the banks. The evening light was low and particular, the kind that makes everything look like something you'd want to remember. Eliza had her arms crossed over herself, but not protectively this time, against the evening chill. She was watching the water. "I used to come here when things were bad," Ronan said. "Not for any specific reason. Just, the water doesn't know anything is wrong. It keeps going. I found that useful." "I had a park bench in Carver County," Eliza said. "Same idea, slightly less scenic." He almost smiled. He looked at the water for a moment, then he said, "I want to ask you something, and I need you to know that I'm not asking it because of the house or the investigation or what came before. I'm asking it because of the past 7 months, because of who you are when there's nothing to manage, because of the way you talked Maisie through the first week of school, and the way you fixed the kitchen chair without telling anyone, and the way you still make coffee strong enough to resurface the floor." He looked at her. "Because you're the person I want to have breakfast with and argue with about decisions and tell things to at the end of the day." Eliza had turned to look at him during this. Her arms were still crossed, but she'd gone very still. "That's a lot of preamble," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to do it right." "You're doing it right," she said. He reached into his coat pocket. He'd had the ring for 3 weeks. It had been his mother's, a plain gold band with a small stone that was not fancy and was not trying to be. It was just a ring that had been on a good woman's hand for 40 years and had some of that in it. He'd taken it out of the box it had been in since his mother died, and he'd put it in his coat pocket and had been trying to find the right moment and had been suspicious of every moment that presented itself as the right one, until finally he decided that the right moment was probably just the next honest one. He held it out, not on one knee. He was 41, and his knee made an opinion known in cold weather, and also this felt like a conversation rather than a performance. "Marry me," he said, "not because we owe it to the past, because I want this to be the rest of my life." Eliza looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She did the assessment that was so characteristic of her, the checking of what was real. And he held still for it, because she deserved to check, because she had been lied to by a forged letter 12 years ago, and had every right to take a moment before believing anything again. Then she unfolded her arms and reached out and took the ring from his hand and held it in her palm and looked at it. "I swore I wasn't going to cry," she said. "I noticed that's not a yes," he said. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright. "Yes," she said. "You knew it was yes." "I didn't want to assume," he said. She put the ring on. It fit, which was either luck or something she'd have said was meant to be and he'd have said was good fortune. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. "I'm still difficult," she said. "I don't want you to think 7 months of domestic life has changed my fundamental personality." "I know," he said, "and Maisie's going to have opinions about this." "She already has opinions about everything," he said. "That's not a problem." Eliza laughed. A real one. Unprepared, slightly surprised by itself. It was the best sound Ronan had heard in possibly years, and he intended to find occasion for it as regularly as possible. They stood at the river for a while longer before walking back. The light was nearly gone, and the first stars were showing, and the ranch appeared ahead of them with its lit windows, warm and specific in the dusk. Maisie was still at the kitchen table when they came in. She looked up from her project with the assessing eyes she'd inherited from both of them, and looked at their faces and then at Eliza's hand and then back at Ronan. "Okay," she said. "Okay?" Eliza said. "I mean..." Maisie put her pencil down. She appeared to be organizing something internally. "I had more to say, but it's actually pretty okay." She looked at Ronan. "You're not going to be weird about it? Try to overdo everything to make up for things?" "I'm going to try not to," he said honestly. "Good," she said. "Because that's more annoying than just being normal." She picked up her pencil. "Can we have the wedding before school ends? I want my friend Clara to be able to come if she visits." Eliza looked at Ronan. Ronan looked at Eliza. "We'll see what we can do," Ronan said. They were married in May, at the riverside, which was Eliza's choice, and also, when Ronan thought about it, obviously the only choice. The bend in the river where they'd stood in April, where the bank was flat and the water moved with its certain uncomplicated confidence, where the evening light on a May afternoon was something that made everything around it look like the best version of itself. It was not a large wedding, it was the right size. Bert Carlo and his wife, Sam Okafor, Pete Rourke, who brought his mother. Dora Haynes, who had become Eliza's friend in the quiet way Dora did everything. Mrs. Farrow from the school, who had become something Maisie didn't have a category for but trusted. Abel, who stood at the back and watched with the expression of a man who had been at this ranch through enough bad winters and long seasons that a good day had a particular weight. Ruth Alderman sent a letter because she couldn't make the journey, but the letter was 4 pages long and contained specific and heartfelt opinions about the importance of postal integrity in human relationships, which was so entirely Ruth that Eliza read it twice and kept it. Clara Voss did not come. Ronan hadn't expected her to. She had done what she came to do and had gone back to building her own life, and he respected that. He hoped it was going well. Maisie stood beside Eliza. She had a wildflower in her hair that she'd picked herself from the creek bank and had put in at an angle that was slightly crooked, and that she'd refused to adjust when Eliza had offered to fix it. She held a small bunch of the same flowers, the bouquet such as it was, because Maisie had pointed out that they grew right there, and it seemed wasteful to bring flowers from somewhere else when there were perfectly good ones on the property. Ronan stood at the water's edge and watched Eliza walk toward him through the grass and thought that 12 years was a long time and a short time depending on which part of it you were standing in, and that the specific, undeserved cruelty of what had been done to them was real and would always be real, and that real things don't stop being real when the story finds its way to a better place. They stay. They're part of the structure. You build around them and sometimes through them, and you carry them with you, and the carrying changes shape over time, but you don't put them down. You just learn what they weigh, and you keep going. He thought about Gideon Crow, briefly, and without the old heat. Gideon was in a legal process that would take years and might still end in something less than full justice, because that was the honest reality of how these things went. His office was occupied now by a man named David Fern, who had been appointed by the territorial government as interim commissioner, who was methodically reviewing every decision Gideon had made and finding the ones that needed undoing. It was slow work. It was necessary work. Ronan had spoken with Fern twice and trusted him as much as he trusted anyone he'd only recently met, which was to say with qualified optimism. The water rights on the Eastern Creek were confirmed valid and permanent. The declaration of paternity for Maisie was in the official record and would remain there. These were small facts and large ones at the same time. Eliza reached him. She was not in white. She was in a deep blue dress the color of the creek in summer, which suited her in a way that white would not have, and she was looking at him with the expression that had replaced the guarded, careful face over 7 months, the one that was still sometimes careful but no longer guarded, the one that let him see through to whatever she actually felt. He took her hand. The man who married them was a justice of the peace named Howell, a small, serious man with a large, serious sense of occasion who spoke the words with the gravity they deserved and not a syllable more, which was exactly right. Maisie watched from beside her mother with the slightly crooked flower in her hair, and at one point she caught Ronan's eye over Eliza's shoulder and gave him a look that contained, in the language she'd developed over 7 months of learning each other, something that was not quite a smile and was much more than one. It was a look that said, "I see this. I'm here. This is real, and I know it." He held her gaze for a moment and gave her back something in his own language, which was quieter and less readable but meant, "I know, me too. We're going to be all right." Then Howell said the final words, and Eliza looked up at him, and he kissed her with the straightforward, honest intention of a man who has stopped performing anything and is just doing the thing itself. And people around them did whatever people do at weddings. Some of them clapped. Bert said something that made his wife elbow him. Abel looked at his boots briefly, in the way he did when he felt something strongly, and didn't know what to do about it. The evening after the wedding, when the guests had gone and Maisie had fallen asleep in the chair by the fire in the particular way she did when a day had used everything she had, Ronan and Eliza sat on the porch in the May dark. It was not cold. For once, not cold. "Do you think he knows?" Eliza said. Ronan understood she meant Gideon. "Probably," he said. "Things get around." "Good," she said. Not with heat, just with the flat, certain satisfaction of a person who has waited a long time for the true version of something to exist. They sat in the quiet that was not empty, but full, the specific fullness of two people who have stopped filling silence with words because they don't need to anymore. Inside, Maisie slept in the chair by the fire with the remaining wildflower still in her hair, still slightly crooked. The almanac was on the floor beside her where it had slid from her lap. The kitchen table was covered with the remains of a wedding dinner that had been simple and good. The letter, the real one, the original, the one that had started everything and ended everything, was in a small cedar box on the shelf in Eliza's room, because she'd decided she wanted to keep it, not as a wound but as evidence. Evidence that what they'd had was real before anyone tried to take it. Evidence that the truth had existed even when it was being buried. The ranch was quiet. The cattle were where they needed to be. The east pasture fence was solid. The creek ran clean along the southern boundary. There was no triumphant ending, exactly. There was just a family on a piece of land in the dark, which sounds like a small thing, and is, actually, everything. The hardest lesson of the whole 12 years, and Ronan had thought about this more than he'd admit out loud, was not what Gideon had done. What Gideon had done was simple, if monstrous. He had replaced love letters with lies because he wanted something he couldn't have and couldn't accept not having. That was a simple kind of evil, the most common kind, the kind that comes from a man who has never learned to bear disappointment. The hard lesson was what you did with the years after, because those years happened. They were real. Maisie grew up without a father for 11 of those years, and that was a true thing, and would always be a true thing, and no wedding by a river changed it. Eliza carried everything alone through all those seasons, and that weight had changed the shape of her, in ways both good and hard, and that was true too. Ronan had built a ranch out of anger he couldn't locate the source of, and he'd done it well, but there was something in him that had missed a softness somewhere along the way, and he was only now, slowly, getting it back. None of that went away. It just got company. That was what he understood now that he hadn't understood before. Grief and loss and stolen time don't get replaced by good things. They get accompanied by them. You don't trade the hard years for the better ones. You carry both. You become large enough to hold both. And if you're lucky, not lucky the way luck comes easily, but lucky the way luck comes when you've done the hard work of staying honest and not running and not letting the wound make you cruel. If you're that kind of lucky, you end up on a porch on a May night with the person you were supposed to build a life with, and a daughter asleep inside who asks exactly the right questions, and a piece of land that is yours and solid under your feet. Eliza leaned her head against his shoulder. He let her. The dark was easy around them. "What are you thinking?" she said. "That Maisie's going to outrun both of us by the time she's 16, he said. Eliza made a sound that was a laugh and an agreement simultaneously. "Obviously," she said. "And that I'm glad you came back," he said. "Even though I know you came back for the hearing and not for me." She was quiet for a moment. "I came back for Maisie," she said. "That's true, but—" She paused. "I also came back because I was tired of the story ending the way it ended. I wanted to see if there was more story." "Is there?" he said. She lifted her head and looked at him in the dark, and even in the dark he could see the look on her face that was no longer carefully managed, no longer guarded, no longer the face of a woman protecting herself from something that might not be real. "A lot more story," she said. He put his arm around her. She settled against him. The May night held them in its mild and indifferent dark, and inside the house a girl with gray-green eyes slept by the fire with a flower in her hair, dreaming whatever 11-year-olds dream when the day has been long and full and real. And that was enough. That was in fact more than enough. That was everything.